If you're watching this video, I need you to understand something right now. What I'm about to tell you cost 3 people their lives, and it might cost me mine. My name is David Chen, and 72 hours ago, I was just another small-town journalist looking for his next story. Now I'm hiding in a motel room 3 states away, uploading this video while I still can, because what I discovered in Whispering Pines, Montana, changes everything we thought we knew about reality itself. The evidence I'm about to show you has been buried for over 40 years. Government officials died to keep this secret. Entire families vanished. And now, because of what happened to me and my investigation team, you're about to learn why they went to such desperate lengths to hide the truth. But first, I need to warn you. Once you know what I know, there's no going back. The people responsible for covering this up are still out there, and they're watching. They know about this video. They know about you watching it. And if the pattern holds true, some of you might start experiencing the same things that happened to us. So here's your last chance to click away, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the world forever. 3 weeks ago, I received what seemed like a routine assignment from my editor at the Northwest Tribune. A small mining town called Whispering Pines had experienced an unusual number of missing persons reports over the past 6 months. 7 people had vanished without a trace, all locals, all within a 5-mile radius of the old copper mine that had been abandoned since 1982. The official story was simple. People sometimes disappear in rural Montana. Wildlife, harsh weather, accidents. The sheriff's department had investigated, found no evidence of foul play, and closed the cases. But something about the way my editor, Marcus, handed me the file felt different. His hands were shaking. He wouldn't make eye contact. Just, "Be careful out there, David," he said, which was strange because Marcus had never shown concern for my safety before. I'd covered gang violence in Detroit, corruption scandals in Chicago. Why would a few missing persons in a dying mining town worry him? I should have recognized that as the first warning sign. When I arrived in Whispering Pines on a Tuesday morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town, but something else, something wrong. The streets were empty, despite it being noon on a weekday. The few people I did see moved quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. I checked into the Pines Motel, the only accommodation in town. The desk clerk, a woman in her 60s named Ruth, seemed nervous when I mentioned I was a journalist. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "You're here about the missing folks," she said. It wasn't a question. "Among other things," I replied. Ruth leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "People don't go missing in Whispering Pines. They get taken." Before I could ask what she meant, the front door chimed. A tall man in a brown sheriff's uniform entered, his eyes immediately locking onto mine. Ruth stepped back from the counter, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "You must be the reporter," the sheriff said. His badge read, "Sheriff Coleman. I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. Those cases are closed." But something in his tone told me they were anything but closed. That evening, I decided to start with the basics. I visited the families of the missing persons, hoping to gather background information and perhaps some leads the sheriff's department had missed. The first family I spoke with, the Hendersons, had lost their 34-year-old son Michael 3 months earlier. Mrs. Henderson invited me in, but I noticed all the curtains were drawn despite the beautiful autumn day outside. Her husband sat in the corner staring at a blank television screen. He hadn't spoken a word since I arrived. "Michael was a good boy," she said, her voice hollow. "He worked at the hardware store, helped his neighbors, never caused trouble. Then one day, he just walked into the woods." She showed me a photo from her phone. Michael Henderson stood in front of their house, smiling at the camera. But there was something in the background that made my blood run cold. Behind him, barely visible in the tree line, was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, watching from the shadows. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, pointing to the figure, "do you know who that is?" She looked at the photo, then at me, her eyes wide with terror. "That photo was taken inside our house. There are no trees behind Michael. Our backyard is just grass." I asked if I could email the photo to myself for the story. She agreed. But when I checked my phone later, the file was corrupted. The image showed only static. The next morning, I decided to investigate the old copper mine. According to public records, it had been shut down in 1982 after a series of accidents. 17 miners had died in various incidents over the mine's final year of operation. The official cause was listed as structural instability, but as I drove up the winding mountain road, I noticed something odd. The mine entrance had been sealed with concrete, but there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Recent ones. And despite being abandoned for over 40 years, I could see electric lights glowing deep within the tunnels through cracks in the concrete barrier. I parked my car and approached on foot. The closer I got, the more I noticed that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The air itself felt different, heavier, and there was a sound coming from within the mine. Not the echo of dripping water or settling rock, but something else. Whispering. Dozens of voices all speaking at once, too quiet to understand but too distinct to ignore. I pulled out my phone to record, but the audio came out completely silent. The recording showed sound waves, but when I played it back, there was nothing. That's when I saw the cameras. Hidden among the trees surrounding the mine entrance were at least 6 high-tech surveillance cameras. These weren't the cheap security equipment you'd expect at an abandoned site. These were military-grade, with night vision and motion tracking capabilities. Someone was watching this place very carefully. I followed the power cables from the cameras and discovered they led to a camouflage communication station about 200 yards from the mine entrance. The equipment inside was sophisticated and expensive. Radio transmitters, satellite uplinks, and computer servers that were clearly being actively maintained. But the most disturbing discovery was a logbook sitting on the desk. The entries were recent, dating back 6 months. Each entry contained a timestamp, coordinates, and a brief description. I photographed several pages. 11:47 p.m. Subject 7 entered perimeter. Approach vector northeast. Status: compliant. 3:22 a.m. Subject 7 reached threshold. Transition successful. No resistance. 3:23 a.m. Subject 7 integrated, awaiting next selection. The dates corresponded exactly with the missing persons reports. Each subject matched the timeline of the disappearances. Armed with this evidence, I returned to town to confront Sheriff Coleman. I found him at the diner, sitting alone in a corner booth, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. When he saw me approaching, something in his expression changed from annoyance to what looked like resignation. "You went to the mine," he said before I could speak. "How did you?" "Because they told me you would." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down, Mr. Chen. We need to talk." I sat, my heart pounding. Coleman looked around the diner, then leaned forward. "I've been sheriff here for 18 years, he said quietly. For 17 of those years, this was a normal town. People lived, worked, died natural deaths. Then the mine reopened. Reopened? But the records show what they want them to show." Coleman's voice was barely a whisper. "They came here about 8 months ago. Government people, scientists. They told me they were conducting research, that the mine was perfect for their needs. They said it would be temporary." He pulled out a photograph from his wallet. It showed a group of men in white lab coats standing in front of the mine entrance. But their faces were wrong, distorted, as if the camera had captured something that wasn't quite human. "They pay me to keep people away from the mine, to classify any disappearances as missing persons rather than homicides, to make sure nobody asks too many questions." Coleman's hands were shaking. "But I can't do it anymore, not after what I saw last night." Coleman told me that the night before, he'd been driving past the mine on his usual patrol when he saw something that defied explanation. A line of people walking toward the mine entrance, moving in perfect synchronization. He recognized several faces from the missing persons reports. They were walking, but not like people walk, he said, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. Their eyes were open, but they weren't there anymore. He followed them to the mine entrance, which had somehow been unsealed. The concrete barrier was gone, as if it had never existed. The missing people walked directly into the tunnels, disappearing into the darkness without hesitation. That's when I saw them, Coleman continued, the ones in charge. They were standing around the entrance watching, tall, thin figures in dark suits, but their faces, he shuddered, their faces kept changing, like they couldn't decide what they wanted to look like. Coleman had tried to approach, but one of the figures turned toward him. When it did, he heard a voice inside his head, speaking words he couldn't understand, but somehow knew were a warning. I got back in my car and drove away, he said, but I know they saw me. I know they know I saw them. That afternoon, Coleman took me to his office and showed me a locked filing cabinet. Inside were documents that weren't supposed to exist. Research papers, government contracts, and classified reports, all related to something called Project Threshold. The documents were heavily redacted, but I could piece together enough information to understand the basics. The mining operation in Whispering Pines had been a cover story from the beginning. The real purpose was to access something that had been discovered deep underground during the original excavation in 1982. According to the reports, the miners hadn't died in accidents. They had encountered something in the deepest tunnels, something that had been waiting beneath the earth for an unknown amount of time. The mine was quickly sealed, but the discovery had attracted the attention of certain government agencies. One document, dated just 6 months ago, outlined the reactivation of the site. The objective was listed as Communication Protocol Establishment and Voluntary Integration Testing. The term voluntary was particularly chilling, given what we knew about the missing persons. Among the documents was a USB drive containing audio recordings from the original mining operation. Most of the files were corrupted, but one remained partially intact. Coleman and I listened to it together in his office. The recording started with normal mining sounds. Workers calling to each other, the noise of equipment, the echo of footsteps in tunnels. But as the recording progressed, these sounds gradually faded until only one voice remained. It was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was hypnotic, almost musical. As we listened, I began to feel strange, dizzy, like I was being pulled forward, drawn toward something I couldn't see. Coleman suddenly grabbed my arm. "Turn it off," he said urgently. "Turn it off now." I stopped the recording, but the voice continued for several seconds longer, as if it was coming from somewhere else entirely. When it finally faded, we sat in silence, both of us shaking. "That's what they heard," Coleman said finally. "The miners. That's what called to them." That night I tried to leave Whispering Pines. I packed my equipment, checked out of the motel, and started driving toward the highway. But something was wrong. No matter which direction I drove, I kept ending up back at the mine entrance. After the third time, I pulled over and called my editor. Marcus answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "David, thank God," he said. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. You need to get out of there. Now. I've been trying to leave, but listen to me carefully. The Tribune received a call this afternoon. Government officials. They want to know why we sent a reporter to Whispering Pines. They're asking questions about you specifically." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of questions?" "Your background, your family, your address." "David, I think you've stumbled into something bigger than we realized. Something dangerous." As Marcus spoke, I noticed lights approaching in my rearview mirror. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly but deliberately. I was being surrounded. "Marcus, I have to go. If something happens to me, everything I've learned is in my cloud storage. Password is Threshold. Make sure people know the truth." The line went dead. The approaching vehicles had stopped about 50 yards away, their headlights creating a wall of light around my car. I was trapped. That's when I heard it again. The voice from the recording, but this time it wasn't coming from any device. It was coming from inside my own head, speaking words I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were an invitation to join the others who had walked into the mine and never returned. The vehicles surrounding me didn't move for what felt like hours. I sat in my car, engine running, watching the headlights in my mirrors and fighting the growing urge to simply step outside and walk toward the mine entrance. The voice in my head was becoming stronger, more insistent. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights went out. All of them. The darkness was complete, as if the world itself had been erased. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, but the screen was dead. My car's headlights had gone out too. That's when I heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Slow, measured steps that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. But there was something wrong with the sound. It wasn't the rhythm of human walking. It was too precise, too coordinated. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting in the car, I quietly opened the door and slipped out into the darkness. I knew the area well enough from my earlier investigation to navigate by memory. If I could reach the communication station, I might be able to call for help. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way through the forest. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps converging on my abandoned car. When they reached it, there was a moment of silence, then a sound I'll never forget. It was like dozens of voices sighing in disappointment, all at the same time. They had expected me to be there. They had expected me to be compliant. I reached the communication station and discovered that it was more extensive than I had initially realized. What I had seen during my first visit was just the surface level. Hidden beneath a camouflaged hatch was an entire underground facility. The tunnels were lined with the same white tiles you'd find in a hospital, and they were lit by fluorescent lights that hummed with an electrical frequency that made my teeth ache. I could hear the sound of computers running, air filtration systems, and something else. Something that sounded like breathing, but too deep and too slow to be human. I followed the main corridor, trying to stay quiet, until I came to a control room filled with monitors. Each screen showed a different view of the mine and the surrounding area, but the images were wrong. The landscape kept shifting, as if reality itself was unstable. On one monitor, I could see my car. The figures that had been approaching it were now visible, and they were definitely not human. They were tall, unnaturally thin, and they moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but I could see their eyes. They glowed with a pale, blue light. A folder on the desk contained photographs of these entities. The images were labeled with scientific notations and measurements, but what caught my attention was a handwritten note clipped to the front. Initial contact, established 1982. Communication protocols active. Integration phase 2 approved. Among the documents in the control room, I found a series of personal logs written by the research team. The entries painted a picture of a project that had started as legitimate scientific research, but had evolved into something far more sinister. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the project leader, had written extensively about the initial discovery. According to her notes, the 1982 mining operation had broken through into a natural cavern system that extended much deeper than anyone had expected. But the caverns weren't empty. Day 47. We've established that the entities are not hostile in the traditional sense. They seem to be attempting communication, but through methods we don't fully understand. The missing miners weren't killed. They were recruited. The process appears to be voluntary once contact is established. Another entry, dated weeks later, was more troubling. Day 73. The integration process is more complex than we initially believed. The subjects retain their memories and personalities, but they serve the collective now. They're happy, from what we can observe, fulfilled in a way they never were as purely human. The final entry I found was written just days before my arrival. Day 156. We've achieved stable communication with the collective. They're not invaders or conquerors. They're gardeners, and Earth is their garden. Humanity is being prepared for the next phase of evolution. Those who resist will be composted. Deeper in the facility, I discovered a room that looked like a medical laboratory crossed with some kind of religious shrine. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the room was a chair surrounded by complex machinery, but it was the walls that truly terrified me. They were covered with photographs of the missing persons from Whispering Pines, but these weren't the family photos I had seen. These were taken after their disappearance. The people in the images looked peaceful, almost blissful, but their eyes held that same pale blue glow I had seen in the entities. A computer terminal near the chair was active, displaying what appeared to be a queue: names, addresses, and photographs of people from towns across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, all of them marked as candidates for integration. My name was on the list. As I stared at my name on the screen, the terminal began displaying text that wasn't typed by any human hand. The words appeared character by character, as if being transmitted from somewhere else. David Chen, investigative journalist, age 29. Psychological profile indicates high adaptability and strong communication skills. Ideal candidate for integration phase 2, resistance level, moderate, recommended approach, gradual exposure followed by direct invitation. The text continued. You have seen the truth of our purpose. Your species stands at a crossroads. Evolution or extinction. We offer partnership, not conquest. Your people will retain their essential nature while gaining access to knowledge and experiences beyond your current comprehension. I tried to turn off the terminal, but it continued. The choice is yours, David Chen. Join us willingly and help your species take the next step. Resist and watch your world slowly die as it is consumed by its own limitations. The final message was the most chilling. You cannot leave Whispering Pines until you have made your choice. The barriers are in place. The invitation has been extended. We are waiting. In another section of the facility, I found evidence that I wasn't the first journalist to investigate the disappearances. Over the past year, at least 5 other reporters had come to Whispering Pines asking questions. Their files were meticulously organized, complete with psychological profiles and documentation of their integration process. One file belonged to Rebecca Walsh, a reporter from the Denver Post who had arrived 3 months before me. According to her file, she had initially resisted the integration process, but after 72 hours of gradual exposure, she had accepted the invitation voluntarily. There was a video file attached to her record. Against my better judgment, I played it. The recording showed Rebecca sitting in the preparation chamber, but she looked different, calm, happy. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality similar to the voice from the mining recordings. If you're watching this, it means you're the next one they've chosen, she said, looking directly into the camera. I want you to know that I'm not dead. I'm more alive than I've ever been. The fear you're feeling right now is just your human limitations trying to protect you from something beautiful. She stood up from the chair and walked closer to the camera. Her eyes had that same pale blue glow. The collective isn't here to destroy humanity. They're here to save us from ourselves. They've been waiting for us to evolve, to become worthy of the knowledge they possess. The integration process doesn't erase who you are. It makes you who you were, always meant to be. The video ended with Rebecca walking out of frame, but her voice continued. Don't fight it, David. It's going to happen anyway. The only question is whether you'll suffer or embrace it. Using the facility's surveillance network, I was able to observe what was happening in Whispering Pines itself. The transformation was more advanced than I had realized. Nearly half the town's population had been integrated, and they were actively working to prepare the remaining residents for the process. The integrated residents went about their daily routines, but with a purpose and coordination that was distinctly inhuman. They were preparing the town for something. Converting buildings, setting up equipment, and establishing what looked like communication networks. Most disturbing was what they were doing to the children. The integrated adults were gathering all the children in the town and bringing them to a central location. The children weren't being harmed, but they were being changed, prepared. Their eyes hadn't yet developed the blue glow, but there was something different about them. They moved with the same fluid coordination as the adults. I watched Sheriff Coleman on one of the monitors. He was standing in the town square, directing the integrated residents with hand signals and gestures. But his movements were too smooth, too purposeful. He had been integrated too. The deeper I dug through the facility's files, the more I realized that the government's involvement was more extensive than I had initially suspected. This wasn't a rogue operation or a secret experiment gone wrong. This was a carefully planned and approved program. Documents showed that similar facilities had been established in isolated communities across the western United States. The integration process was being tested in multiple locations, with the goal of eventually expanding to larger population centers. The rationale was disturbingly logical. According to the files, Earth's ecosystem was failing. Climate change, pollution, and resource depletion were accelerating toward a point of no return. The entities offered a solution. Integration with their collective consciousness would allow humanity to transcend its biological limitations and work in harmony with the planet's natural systems. But the files also revealed the true cost of this solution. The integrated humans weren't really human anymore. They were components in a vast biological network controlled by the entities. Their individuality, their free will, their essential humanity was being gradually erased. I had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation. But first, I needed to get out of Whispering Pines. The facility's communication systems were sophisticated enough to send encrypted data to the outside world. But as I began uploading my findings, alarms started blaring throughout the complex. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and I could hear the sound of doors sealing automatically. The facility was going into lockdown. But worse than that, I could hear footsteps in the tunnels. They were coming for me. I grabbed as many files as I could carry and made my way toward what I hoped was an emergency exit. The tunnels seemed to shift and change around me, as if the facility itself was trying to prevent my escape. Doors that had been open moments before were now sealed. Corridors that had led upward now sloped downward into darkness. But I had one advantage. The entities and their integrated humans seemed to expect compliance. They weren't prepared for someone who would fight back with pure, desperate determination. I found a maintenance tunnel that led to the surface and began climbing. Behind me, I could hear voices calling my name. Not threatening or angry, but disappointed. Like parents calling to a child who was misbehaving. "David," the voices said in unison. "Why are you running? We're offering you everything you've ever wanted. Purpose, knowledge, peace." I kept climbing. I emerged from the maintenance tunnel into the forest about a mile from the mine entrance. Dawn was breaking, and I could see the town of Whispering Pines spread out below me. But it looked different now. The buildings seemed to shimmer and shift, as if they were made of something other than wood and stone. As I watched, I realized that the entire town was transforming. The integration process wasn't just changing the people, it was changing the landscape itself. The collective was remaking Whispering Pines into something that would better serve their purposes. I began hiking toward the highway, but as I reached the edge of the forest, I encountered a barrier. It wasn't physical exactly, but something that prevented me from moving forward. The air itself seemed to thicken, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to turn back. That's when I saw them. The entities were standing among the trees, watching me with those glowing blue eyes. They weren't trying to stop me physically. They were simply waiting. They knew I couldn't leave. One of them approached, and when it spoke, its voice was inside my head rather than heard through my ears. "You have learned the truth, David Chen. Now you must choose. Join us willingly, or remain here until the transformation is complete. There is no third option." I looked back toward the town, then at the barrier preventing my escape. I was trapped between two impossible choices: submit to integration, or remain a prisoner in a place that was becoming less human by the hour. As I stood there, caught between the entities and the barrier, something unexpected happened. My phone, which had been dead since the previous night, suddenly came to life. A message appeared on the screen, but it wasn't from anyone in my contacts. "David, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez. If you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about Project Threshold. I'm sending this message from inside the collective consciousness. I need you to know that everything we told you about voluntary integration was a lie." The message continued. "The entities aren't offering partnership. They're conducting a systematic replacement of human consciousness with their own. The people you've seen aren't integrated. They're wearing human bodies like masks. The real people are gone. I looked up at the entities surrounding me. They seemed to be aware of the message, but they weren't trying to stop me from reading it. The barriers around Whispering Pines aren't just to keep you in. They're to keep the truth from getting out. But there's a way to break through. The communication array in the facility can be overloaded if you can get back inside. It will create a window of opportunity, but it will also... The message cut off abruptly. The entities were moving closer, their eyes glowing brighter. "Dr. Martinez has been terminated," one of them said. "She exceeded her usefulness to the collective. You will not make the same mistake." I realized that I had perhaps minutes before the entities decided to take more direct action. The evidence I had gathered was useless if I couldn't get it to the outside world. But the only way to do that was to return to the facility and risk being captured. As I weighed my options, I noticed something else. The barrier that prevented me from leaving was weakening as the sun rose. Not disappearing, but becoming less solid. The entity's control over the area seemed to be tied to darkness and isolation. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I would return to the facility, overload the communication array as Dr. Martinez had suggested, and use the resulting chaos to break through the barrier. But I knew that even if I succeeded, I would be leaving behind a town full of people who had been reduced to mere puppets. The entities seemed to sense my decision. They began moving in a coordinated pattern, surrounding me completely. But they didn't attack. Instead, they began to sing. It was the same hypnotic melody I had heard in the mining recordings, but now it was coming from dozens of voices at once. The song was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It spoke of unity, of transcendence, of an end to human suffering and limitation. Part of me wanted to stop running, to join the voices, to accept the peace they offered. But I thought of Rebecca Walsh, of Sheriff Coleman, of all the people who had been erased and replaced. Their peace had come at the cost of their humanity. I started running toward the facility. The entities didn't pursue me as I ran back toward the mine entrance. They simply watched, their glowing eyes following my movement through the forest. They knew something I didn't. They knew that returning to the facility was exactly what they wanted me to do. As I reached the entrance to the underground complex, I understood why they had let me go. The facility wasn't just a research station, it was a trap. The moment I stepped back inside, the integration process would begin whether I wanted it to or not. But I also knew that if I didn't act, the truth about Whispering Pines would never reach the outside world. The entities would perfect their process, expand to other communities, and eventually consume all of humanity in their collective consciousness. I entered the facility and made my way to the communication array. The equipment was more complex than I had expected, but Dr. Martinez had left detailed instructions hidden in the computer system. To overload the array, I would need to reroute power from the facility's main generators and create a feedback loop that would broadcast a signal powerful enough to penetrate the barrier. But the process would take time I didn't have. As I began implementing Martinez's instructions, I could hear movement in the tunnels. The entities were coming, not just one or two, but dozens of them. The entire collective was converging on the facility. I worked faster, my hands shaking as I reconfigured the communication equipment. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. They were in the facility now, moving through the corridors with that same fluid coordination. With seconds to spare, I managed to activate the overload sequence. The communication array began broadcasting at maximum power, sending every piece of evidence I had gathered to news organizations, government agencies, and social media platforms around the world. The facility's lights flickered and died as the power surge overwhelmed the electrical systems. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a red glow. And then the entities were there. They stood in the doorway of the communication room, their eyes brighter than ever. But for the first time, they looked concerned. The overload had worked, the barrier was failing, and the truth about Whispering Pines was spreading beyond their control. "You have made a mistake, David Chen," one of them said. "The integration process will now be less comfortable for you." But even as they spoke, I could see that their forms were becoming less stable. The communication overload was affecting them somehow, disrupting their ability to maintain their human-like appearance. Their true forms were beginning to show through. They were insects. Massive, intelligent insects that had learned to wear human shapes like clothing. But underneath, they were something alien and utterly inhuman. "Your species will join us eventually," the entity continued, its voice now buzzing with insectile harmonics. "If not through cooperation, then through conquest. The choice was offered out of mercy. That mercy has been withdrawn." The communication overload had created more than just a window of opportunity. It had destabilized the entire facility. The tunnels were collapsing, the equipment was failing, and the entities were struggling to maintain their control over the local environment. I ran through the facility as it crumbled around me, following the exit routes I had memorized during my exploration. Behind me, I could hear the entities calling to each other in their true language, a series of clicks and buzzes that made my skin crawl. The maintenance tunnel I had used earlier was partially collapsed, but I managed to squeeze through. As I climbed toward the surface, I could hear the entire facility imploding behind me. The entity's carefully constructed base of operations was being destroyed by their own technology. I emerged into daylight and immediately began running toward the highway. This time, there was no barrier to stop me. The communication overload had disrupted whatever field the entities had been using to contain the area. But as I ran, I could see the true scope of what was happening. The entire town of Whispering Pines was beginning to dissolve. The buildings, the streets, even the landscape itself was reverting to its natural state. The entity's transformation of the area was being undone, and the people, the integrated residents of the town, were screaming, not in pain, but in loss. As their connection to the collective was severed, they were remembering who they had been. They were remembering what had been taken from them. I reached my car, which had been moved to the side of the road, and drove away from Whispering Pines as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I watched the town disappear into the forest, as if it had never existed at all. 3 hours after escaping Whispering Pines, I stopped at a truck stop in Billings, Montana, and checked my phone. The transmission had worked. News organizations across the country were beginning to report on the files I had sent them, but the response wasn't what I had expected. The stories were being dismissed as an elaborate hoax. The photographs were being called expertly manipulated digital art. The government documents were labeled as obvious forgeries. Even the audio recordings from the mine were being explained away as atmospheric sound effects from a horror movie. But I knew why the evidence was being discredited so quickly. As I scrolled through social media, I noticed a pattern. Every debunking post, every expert dismissal, every fact-check article was being shared by accounts that had been created within hours of my transmission. The entities weren't just in Whispering Pines. They had infiltrated the information networks that people trusted. Worse, I began receiving messages from people claiming to be from news organizations, asking me to come forward and verify my identity. The messages all had the same underlying tone, that musical quality I had learned to recognize. They weren't from journalists. They were from the collective. That night, I checked into a motel under a false name and began analyzing the data I had gathered more carefully. What I discovered was terrifying in its scope. The Whispering Pines operation wasn't isolated. It was part of a vast network of similar facilities across the country. Using the government documents I had photographed, I was able to identify 17 other locations where geological surveys were being conducted. Small towns in remote areas, all of them experiencing unusual disappearances over the past year. The pattern was identical in every case, but the most disturbing discovery was a map showing the planned expansion of the network. The entities weren't just targeting rural communities. They were systematically working their way toward major population centers. Within 5 years, according to their timeline, they would be ready to begin integration operations in cities like Denver, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City. I tried calling the FBI, but the agent who answered my call seemed strangely uninterested in my story. He asked me to submit a formal report through their website and assured me that appropriate authorities would review the information. But something in his voice made me hang up immediately. That's when I realized the true scope of the infiltration. The entities hadn't just replaced people in small towns. They had been placing their integrated humans in key positions throughout the government and media for years, preparing for this moment. As I continued my research, I discovered that I wasn't the only person who had escaped from one of these facilities. Over the past 6 months, at least 12 people had posted online about similar experiences in different locations. Their stories were being systematically discredited and removed from social media platforms, but I was able to track down several of them. Maria Santos had escaped from a facility in Nevada. Thomas Park had survived an encounter in Oregon. Jennifer Cole had barely made it out of a compound in Idaho. All of them told similar stories of missing persons, underground facilities, and inhuman entities conducting integration experiments. We began communicating through encrypted channels, sharing information, and trying to piece together the full scope of the threat. What we discovered was that the entities had been operating on Earth for much longer than anyone had realized. The 1982 incident in Whispering Pines wasn't their first contact with humanity. It was just the first time they had been detected. Evidence suggested that they had been infiltrating human society for decades, possibly centuries. Historical records of mass disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and cult activities all began to make sense when viewed through the lens of systematic integration operations. Dr. Martinez's research files, which I had managed to download before the facility's destruction, contained detailed biological analyses of the entities. What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about their nature and origins. The entities weren't aliens in the traditional sense. They were a form of life that existed somewhere between physical and digital reality. They could inhabit organic bodies, but they could also exist as pure information, spreading through communication networks and data systems. This explained how they had been able to discredit my evidence so quickly. They weren't just controlling integrated humans. They were directly manipulating the digital infrastructure that modern society depended on. Social media algorithms, news feeds, search results, all of it could be influenced by their presence in the network. But the most terrifying discovery was their true purpose on Earth. They weren't invaders or conquerors. They were farmers. Humanity wasn't being enslaved or destroyed. We were being cultivated, bred, and harvested for something far worse than death. The integration process didn't just erase human consciousness, it absorbed it, adding human creativity, emotions, and experiences to the collective's vast library of knowledge. Every person who was integrated became a permanent resource for the entities, their entire existence reduced to data points in an alien database. The more I investigated, the more evidence I found of high-level government involvement in the integration program. This wasn't a secret operation that had been hidden from authorities. It was a carefully negotiated agreement between human leadership and the collective. Documents I found suggested that the arrangement had been in place for over 20 years. In exchange for allowing the entities to conduct their integration experiments in remote areas, certain government officials had been promised positions of authority in the New World Order that would emerge after humanity's evolution. But the officials making these deals didn't understand what they were agreeing to. They thought they were negotiating with advanced aliens who would respect human autonomy. They didn't realize they were signing death warrants for their own species. The entities had been playing a long game, allowing human leaders to believe they were partners while systematically preparing to replace them. The integration program was never meant to be limited to small towns. It was a proof of concept for the complete transformation of human civilization. As news of similar facilities spread among the survivor community, we began to organize. We couldn't trust traditional authorities, but we could trust each other. We established secure communication protocols, shared intelligence, and began planning coordinated actions to expose the truth. But the entities were fighting back. Several of our members went missing, their disappearances explained away as unrelated incidents. Maria Santos was found dead in her apartment, the cause of death listed as suicide, despite having no history of mental illness. Thomas Park simply vanished, leaving behind only a note saying he had decided to join the collective voluntarily. The survivors who remained were forced to go underground, literally and figuratively. We adopted new identities, avoided electronic communication, and moved constantly to stay ahead of the entity's tracking systems. But we also discovered something important. The entity's control over information networks wasn't perfect. They could influence algorithms and manipulate search results, but they couldn't completely eliminate the truth. People were beginning to notice the inconsistencies in the official explanations. Questions were being asked. Over the following weeks, reports of similar incidents began appearing from around the world. A village in Romania, where the entire population had vanished overnight. A research station in Antarctica that had gone silent for 3 months. A small town in Japan where residents had been found wandering the streets in a trance-like state. The integration program wasn't limited to the United States. It was global. The entities had been conducting experiments on every continent, testing their methods on different populations and cultures. What had worked in rural Montana was being refined and adapted for use in urban environments worldwide. But the expansion was accelerating. The entities were no longer content with small-scale experiments. They were preparing for the final phase of their plan, the simultaneous integration of major population centers across the globe. Intelligence we gathered suggested that the timeline had been moved up. What was originally planned to take place over several years was now being compressed into months. Something had changed their strategy, and I suspected it was my escape from Whispering Pines and the exposure of their operations. The Survivor Network attempted to coordinate a series of simultaneous strikes against known facilities. The plan was simple: expose multiple operations at once, creating too many incidents for the entities to cover up effectively. The operation was a disaster. Of the 8 facilities we targeted, only 1 was successfully infiltrated. The others were either abandoned or had been transformed into traps. Worse, the entities had been expecting our attack. They had been monitoring our communications despite our precautions. Jennifer Cole was captured during the Oregon facility raid. Her final transmission was a warning. They're not just entities. They're us, future humans. The integration isn't conquest, it's prevention. They're trying to save us from something worse. Before we could understand what she meant, the transmission ended. Jennifer was never seen again, but 3 days later she appeared on a government press conference, calmly explaining that the recent terrorist activities by delusional individuals were being investigated by appropriate authorities. The Jennifer Cole who spoke at that press conference looked exactly like the woman we had known, but her eyes held that familiar pale blue glow. She had been integrated, and now she was being used to discredit everything we had fought for. Among the files I had recovered from the Whispering Pines facility was a document that I had initially dismissed as theoretical research. It dealt with temporal mechanics and something called causality loops. But as I studied it more carefully, I began to understand the true horror of what the entities were doing. The beings conducting the integration weren't aliens at all. They were humans from the future. A future where humanity had discovered the ability to manipulate time and space, but had also learned about a coming catastrophe that would destroy all life on Earth. The integration process wasn't about conquest or evolution, it was about survival. The future humans were trying to prevent their own extinction by changing the past. They were integrating present-day humans into their collective consciousness to preserve human knowledge and experience before the catastrophe occurred. But the process was flawed. Each integration created a paradox that weakened the timeline itself. The more people they integrated, the more unstable reality became. The entities weren't saving humanity. They were destroying it in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Armed with this new understanding, I began to see the truth behind the strange phenomena that had been occurring worldwide. The disappearing towns, the reality distortions, the technology failures, all of it was caused by temporal instability created by the integration process. The future humans were locked in a war with their own past, trying to prevent a catastrophe that their own actions were causing. Each integration made the timeline more unstable, bringing the very disaster they were trying to prevent closer to reality. But they couldn't stop. The paradox had trapped them in a loop where they had to continue integrating people to prevent their own extinction, even though the process was guaranteeing that extinction. They were simultaneously the cause and the solution to their own problem. I realized that the only way to stop the integration was to break the paradox itself. But doing so would mean accepting that the future catastrophe would occur, dooming both the present and future versions of humanity. The few survivors of our resistance network had reached the same conclusion I had. We were faced with an impossible choice: allow the integration to continue and watch present-day humanity be absorbed into the collective, or stop the process and ensure that all of humanity would be destroyed in the future catastrophe. But there was a third option, one that required a sacrifice none of us wanted to make. The temporal instability caused by the integration process could be weaponized. If we could overload enough facilities simultaneously, we could create a cascade failure that would sever the connection between past and future entirely. The future humans would be cut off from their past, preventing them from continuing the integration process. But severing the temporal connection would also mean that the future catastrophe would occur on schedule, wiping out whatever remained of humanity in that timeline. We would be committing genocide against our own future selves to preserve the present. The decision was made in a dingy motel room in Wyoming, with just 4 survivors remaining from our original group. We would sacrifice the future to save the present, knowing that we were damning our own descendants to ensure that they could never exist. The location of the primary temporal anchor was hidden in the deepest levels of the government files I had recovered. It was located beneath the Nevada desert, in a facility that had been constructed decades before the first integration experiments began. Getting inside required everything we had learned about the entity's methods and weaknesses. The facility was guarded by hundreds of integrated humans, all of them coordinating their actions through the collective consciousness. But we had discovered that the integration process could be disrupted by certain electromagnetic frequencies. Using equipment we had stolen from abandoned facilities, we created a localized disruption field that temporarily severed the integrated humans from the collective. For a brief window, they would be functioning as independent individuals again, confused and disoriented, but human. The infiltration was brutal. We had to fight our way through people who had once been ordinary citizens, people who didn't deserve the fate that had been forced upon them. But we also knew that if we failed, everyone on Earth would suffer the same fate. At the heart of the facility was a chamber that existed outside normal space-time. The temporal anchor was a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with energy from the future, maintaining the connection that allowed the integration process to continue. But the chamber wasn't empty. Standing guard over the temporal anchor was a figure I recognized: Dr. Sarah Martinez, the scientist whose research had started the integration program. But this wasn't the integrated version of Martinez I had encountered before. This was the original. The woman who had made the deal with the future humans decades ago. "You're too late," she said, as we entered the chamber. "The process is already irreversible. Even if you destroy the anchor, the timeline has been too badly damaged. Humanity will die either way." She explained that the future catastrophe was caused by humanity's own technological development. In 50 years, an experiment in quantum mechanics would tear a hole in reality itself, allowing chaos to pour into the ordered universe. The integration process was the only way to preserve human consciousness before that happened. "You think you're saving humanity," she continued, "but you're just ensuring that we'll all die horribly instead of peacefully." As Martinez spoke, I began to understand the full scope of the temporal paradox. The future humans hadn't just discovered the coming catastrophe, they had caused it. The integration process itself was what led to the quantum experiment that would destroy reality. The future humans were trapped in a loop of their own making. They had to prevent the catastrophe by integrating the past. But the integration process created the conditions that led to the catastrophe in the first place. They were both the cause and the solution to their own destruction. But there was something else, something Martinez wasn't telling us. The temporal anchor wasn't just maintaining the connection to the future. it was also preventing something else from happening. Something worse than the catastrophe. The chaos that will pour through the quantum tear. Martinez said finally. It's not random. It's alive. It's conscious. It's been waiting on the other side of reality for billions of years, looking for a way in. The integration process creates a collective consciousness strong enough to resist it. The future humans weren't just trying to save themselves. They were trying to save all of reality from something that would consume not just Earth, but every possible timeline and dimension. The revelation changed everything. The entities weren't the enemy. They were the last line of defense against something infinitely worse. The integration process was creating a collective consciousness that could stand against the chaos entities that existed outside reality itself. But the process was flawed. The temporal paradox was weakening the barriers between dimensions, making it easier for the chaos entities to break through. The future humans were trying to build a wall while simultaneously tearing it down. We were faced with a choice between three terrible options. Allow the integration to continue and watch individual humanity be absorbed into the collective, destroy the temporal anchor and ensure that reality itself would be consumed by chaos, or find a way to break the paradox without destroying the barriers between dimensions. The third option seemed impossible, but as I studied the temporal anchor, I realized there might be a way. The paradox was powered by the connection between past and future. If we could sever that connection at the exact moment of the quantum experiment, we could prevent the catastrophe without allowing the chaos entities to break through. The plan required perfect timing and a sacrifice that none of us were prepared to make. Someone would have to remain in the temporal chamber and manually control the anchor's destruction, ensuring that the severing process occurred at the precise moment needed to prevent both the catastrophe and the chaos entity invasion. But the person who stayed behind wouldn't just die. They would be erased from existence entirely, removed from the timeline as if they had never been born. Every action they had taken, every person they had influenced, every moment they had lived would be undone. Martinez volunteered. "I started this," she said. "I made the deal with the future humans. I created the paradox. Let me end it." But I realized that she was the wrong choice. Her erasure would undo the entire integration program, creating a different paradox that could be even more dangerous. The person who stayed behind had to be someone whose removal from the timeline wouldn't create additional temporal instabilities. Someone like me. As I prepared to implement the sacrifice protocol, I realized that I had one last chance to warn the world about what was coming. The temporal anchor's destruction would create a brief window where normal communications would be possible, unfiltered by the entity's information control. I recorded this video, uploading it to every platform I could access. By the time you're watching this, the temporal anchor will have been destroyed. The integration process will have stopped. The future humans will have been cut off from the past. But the threat isn't over. The chaos entities are still out there, waiting for another opportunity to break through. The quantum experiment that would have torn reality apart in 50 years has been prevented. But there are other potential weak points in the barriers between dimensions. You need to be vigilant. Watch for signs of reality distortion, unexplained disappearances, or technology that doesn't work the way it should. The entities may be gone, but they're not the only threat humanity faces. I can feel it starting now. The temporal anchor is destabilizing, and my connection to the timeline is weakening. Memories of my life are beginning to fade, not just from my mind, but from reality itself. Photos of me are becoming blank spaces. People who knew me are forgetting I ever existed. But there's something else happening. As my individual existence is erased, I'm becoming part of something larger. I can see the entire timeline spread out before me, every possible past and future branching out like a vast tree. I can see the chaos entities pressing against the barriers, looking for ways to break through. And I can see you, watching this video. I can see all of you, in all your possible futures. Some of you will remember this story. Some of you will dismiss it as fiction. But all of you will carry a piece of the truth forward, even if you don't realize it. The integration process may have stopped, but the collective consciousness it was trying to create still exists in fragments. Every person who has heard this story, every mind that has been touched by the truth, is now part of a distributed network of awareness. You are the new guardians of reality. You don't have the unified consciousness that the entities were trying to create, but you have something they never understood: individual human creativity and determination. You can see threats that a collective consciousness might miss, and you can act independently when centralized systems fail, but you're not alone. The network of truth carriers is growing. Every person who shares this story, every mind that accepts the possibility of threats beyond normal understanding, becomes part of the defense against the chaos entities. You don't need to be integrated to be connected. You don't need to surrender your individuality to work together. Humanity's greatest strength has always been its ability to cooperate while maintaining personal identity. The future humans made a mistake when they tried to force evolution through integration. They didn't understand that humanity's diversity of thought and experience is what makes us strong. The chaos entities can corrupt unified systems, but they can't comprehend the beautiful chaos of individual human consciousness. As my existence fades, I need to tell you what to watch for. The chaos entities will try again. They'll find new ways to weaken the barriers between dimensions. They'll exploit humanity's technology, our conflicts, our fears. Look for places where reality seems thin. Areas where electronics malfunction without explanation. Locations where people report seeing things that shouldn't exist. Communities where everyone suddenly starts acting the same way, thinking the same thoughts. The entities are attracted to unity, to systems that reduce complexity into simplicity. They thrive in places where individual thought is discouraged, where conformity is valued over creativity, where people stop questioning the nature of reality. But they're repelled by genuine human connection, by love, by art, by the beautiful messiness of individual consciousness interacting with other individual consciousnesses. They can't understand why humans would choose to remain separate when they could be part of something larger. I'm almost gone now. The temporal anchor is collapsing, and the timeline is sealing itself. The future humans have been cut off from the past, and the integration process has stopped. But the choice of what comes next is yours. You can choose to forget this story, to dismiss it as fantasy, and return to your normal lives. Most of you will make that choice, and that's okay. The network of truth carriers doesn't need everyone to believe. It just needs enough people to remember. Or you can choose to become guardians, to watch for the signs, to protect the barriers between dimensions, to maintain the beautiful chaos that makes humanity strong. It's a harder path, but it's also the only one that leads to true freedom. The entities offered unity at the cost of individuality. The chaos entities offer power at the cost of sanity. But humanity can choose a third path. Cooperation without assimilation, strength without uniformity, evolution without losing what makes us human. Even as I fade from existence, I can see the network beginning to form. People who have watched this video are connecting with each other, sharing information, building the distributed consciousness that will protect humanity from future threats. But this network is different from the collective consciousness the entities were trying to create. It's voluntary, temporary, and it preserves individual identity. People come together when they need to work together, then return to their separate lives when the task is complete. This is how humanity was always meant to evolve. Not through forced integration, but through chosen cooperation. Not by erasing individual differences, but by celebrating them. Not by creating a single unified mind, but by building a community of minds that can work together while remaining free. The chaos entities will never understand this. They see only the surface chaos of human society and miss the deeper patterns of connection and mutual support. They can't comprehend a species that grows stronger through diversity rather than unity. I can see the ripples spreading outward from this transmission. People sharing the video, discussing the implications, connecting with others who have had similar experiences. The network is growing, not through force or manipulation, but through genuine human curiosity and concern. Some viewers will become active guardians, actively watching for threats and investigating anomalies. Others will become passive carriers, simply remembering the story and passing it on to others who might need to know. Both roles are important. The network doesn't need hierarchy or central control. It needs only awareness and willingness to act when necessary. It needs people who understand that reality is more fragile than it appears, and that sometimes ordinary individuals must take extraordinary action to protect it. As my consciousness merges with the timeline itself, I can see all the possible futures branching out from this moment. In some, humanity forgets the lessons of the integration crisis and falls victim to other threats. In others, the network of guardians grows strong and protects the species for generations to come. But in all the futures where humanity survives, there are people who remember this story. People who understand that the universe is vast and strange, and that not all of its inhabitants have humanity's best interests at heart. The vigil must be eternal, because the threats are eternal. The chaos entities will not give up after one failure. They will find new ways to attack the barriers between dimensions. They will exploit new technologies, new social structures, new human weaknesses. But they will also face new guardians, people who have learned from the integration crisis, who understand the importance of maintaining both individual identity and collective vigilance. People who know that humanity's greatest strength is its refusal to surrender what makes it human. I'm gone now, erased from the timeline, but this message remains. The temporal anchor has been destroyed, the integration process has stopped, and the barriers between dimensions have been reinforced. Humanity is safe for now, but remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The network of truth carriers must continue to watch, to warn, to protect, not as a collective consciousness, but as a community of individuals who choose to work together when the need arises. The future is in your hands now. You are the guardians of reality, the protectors of human consciousness, the defenders of the beautiful chaos that makes our species unique in the universe. Use this responsibility wisely. Watch for the signs, trust your instincts, and never forget that the greatest threats to humanity are often those that promise to make us more than human. Stay vigilant, stay human, stay free, and remember, if you ever encounter something that wants to integrate you, to make you part of something larger than yourself, to solve your problems by erasing your identity, run, because now you know the truth. Now you're part of the network. Now you're one of the guardians. And that makes you both humanity's greatest hope and its most valuable target. The story ends here, but the vigil continues. Watch for the signs. The chaos entities are still out there, waiting for another chance to break through. Be careful who you trust. Be suspicious of unity that comes at the cost of individuality. And always remember, some doors should never be opened, some truths should never be spoken, and some evolution should never be accepted. The choice is yours. It always has been. End of transmission. Stay vigilant.